Hello everyone, welcome to lecture 3 of CIN 411. This week we shall be exploring the concept of soldering. While soldering is a common process used with electronics and computing devices, there are few things one must adhere to and know of when performing a solder. This lecture will be a guide to you and will guide you through the soldering process. Soldering is a process used for joining metal parts to form a mechanical or electrical bond. It typically uses a low melting point metal, alloy, or a solder, or the soldering iron, as we call it locally, which is melted and applied to the metal parts to be joined, and this bonds to the metal parts and forms a connection when the solder solidifies. Soldering is a process in which two or more metal items are joined together by melting and then flowing a filler metal into the joint, the filler metal having a relatively low melting point. There are three forms of soldering, each requiring progressively higher temperatures and producing an increasingly stronger joint strength. Soft soldering, which originally uses a tin lead alloy as the filter metal. Silver soldering, which uses an alloy containing silver. Brazing, which uses a brass alloy for the filler. The word alloy may also mean a soldering iron in this case. Soldering is used to form a permanent connection between electronic components. The metal to be soldered is heated with a soldering iron and then solder is melted into the connection. You can use a solderless breadboard to make test circuits, but if you want your circuit to last for more than a few days, you will want to solder the components together. Things that one must take care of. Only the solder melts, not the parts that are being soldered. Solder is a metallic glue that holds the parts together and forms a connection that allows electrical current to flow. Materials and equipment. A soldering iron. A soldering iron is used to heat the connections to be soldered. For electronic circuits, you should use a 25 to 40 watt soldering iron. Higher wattages soldering irons are not necessarily hotter. They are able to heat larger components. A 40-watt soldering iron makes joints faster than a 25-watt soldering iron does. A soldering iron can be purchased at any hardware stores and at most large departmental stores. Refer to the image to realize what a soldering iron may look like. Materials and equipments. Continued solder. A solder has a lower melting point than the metals that are being connected to. A rosin core acts as a flux. It prevents oxidization of the metals that are being connected and enhances the ability of the solder to wet the surface that are being joined. Flux promotes melting. The solder melts when it is heated by the soldering iron, but the metals being joined will not melt. Solder that is used to join copper pipes has an acid core, which is appropriate for pipes but will corrode electronic connections. Use solder that has a rosin core. Rosin core solder is also fabricated with a hollow core inside the soldering wire. The image illustrates an example of solder, also known as soldering iron. Materials and equipments continued. A soldering stand. Stand on which to hold the hot soldering iron. There are a variety of stands available. It is important to always keep the hot iron in its stand when not in use. The image illustrates how a soldering stand may look. Materials and equipments continued. Sponge. A sponge or damp sponge is used to clean the tip of the iron. Refer to the illustration given in the slide. This is what the entire composition may look like. So you have a soldering iron, which is placed in the soldering stand, and the damp sponge is used to clean the tip of the soldering iron. A wire stripper is used for cutting off the solder. A prototype board is used to test the soldering process. And a solder braid is where the solder or the soldering wire is actually riveted to. Safety precautions. A soldering iron can heat to around 400 degrees Celsius, which can burn you or start fire. So use it carefully. Unplug the iron when not in use. Keep the power cord away from spots where it can be tripped over. Take great care of avoid touching the tip of the soldering iron on a power line or when it is hot. Always return the soldering iron to its stand when not in use. Never put the soldering iron down on your workbench even for a moment. Work in a well-ventilated area. The smoke that will form as you melt solder is mostly from the flux and can be quite irritating. Avoid breathing it in by keeping your head to the side of, not above, your work. Solder contains lead, which is a poisonous metal. Wash your hands after the entire soldering process. These are some of the safety precautions and cautions one might want to take while soldering equipments or devices or any electronic boards. Preparing the soldering iron, tinning the tip. Place the soldering iron in its stand and plug it in. Wait for the soldering iron to heat up. Moisten the sponge. Wipe the tip of the iron on the damp sponge. This will clean the tip. Melt the little solder on the tip of the iron. This is called thinning, and it will have the heat flow from the iron's tip to the joint. The solder will flow onto the tip, producing a bright, shiny surface. If the solder will not flow onto the tip, clean it by wiping it on the wet sponge. When tinned, wipe excess solder off the wet sponge. You do not need to tin the tip before every joint, but you should retin it if it has gone dull when the soldering iron has not been used for a few minutes. Check the manufacturer's instructions related to tinning the tip. The tip of the soldering iron should be a shiny silver color. If it is black and pitted, replace it with a new one. These are some of the references that you would want to refer to learn more about the soldering process. And with this, we conclude our lecture for CRN 411 for week 5. Thank you, everyone.